Welcome to another video from explainingcomputers.com. This time we're going to look at long-term data storage options for home computer users. In part, we're going to learn from what happens in organizations, and in organizations a distinction is often drawn between data backup and data archiving. Here, data backup is the process of duplicating active data to prevent data loss. Meanwhile, data archiving is the process of moving an active data to long-term storage to preserve it for legal compliance, historical reference, or potential future use. For home users, the distinction between backups and archives is often less clear. However, most people do have some critical data, including personal photos and videos, and legal and other documents that they want to store on a far more long-term and secure basis than their general backups. And preserving such data is what this video is all about. The 5 most common storage media are internal and external hard drives, internal and external SSDs, USB drives and memory cards, writable optical media, and tape cartridges. Pretty much all modern data storage utilizes one of these. However, from a user perspective, it's common to distinguish between the use of such media on a local basis and in a cloud data center. And so, when considering long-term storage options, we can also add in cloud storage, where data is kept on third-party hard drives, SSDs, or tape cartridges that are accessed over the internet. For many years, long-term storage strategies were primarily concerned with selecting the right media. For example, this 2008 Digital Preservation Guidance Note from the UK National Archives is focused on choosing the best media based on longevity, capacity, viability, obsolescence, cost, and susceptibility. And whilst this is still important, approaches to long-term storage have moved on. Reflecting this, the current edition of the Digital Preservation Handbook from the Digital Preservation Coalition notes that previously the norm was for storing digital materials using discrete media items, e.g. individual CDs, tapes, etc., which are then migrated periodically to address degradation and obsolescence. But today it has become more common practice to use resilient IT storage systems with digital material decoupled from the underlying mechanism of its storage. A resilient IT storage system refers to a combination of storage media and processes that preserve data. For home users, this means that effective long-term storage now requires 2 things. And whilst the first is media selection, the second is taking regular actions to ensure that data is preserved. In organizations, archive storage typically involves a mix of hard drives, cloud, and tape cartridges. Tape indeed remains popular, with LTO or linear tape open cartridges like this one able to retain data for up to 30 years. And whilst this particular cartridge has a capacity of 400 gigabytes, they are available in capacities of up to 18 terabytes. However, as we can see on the LTO World website, the drives needed to access LTO cartridges typically cost between $3,000 and $10,000. And so, in this video, we're going to dismiss local tape storage for home users on cost grounds. This leaves us with hard drives, SSDs, USB drives or memory cards, optical media, and cloud storage. And contrary to what some people may advise, all of these may be used in a resilient long-term storage system, provided they are appropriately managed. However, because different types of storage have different data retention characteristics, the media you choose will determine how regularly you will need to take actions to preserve your data. So, let's run through the options, including figures for data retention. Just before we start, it's important to stress that nobody can give you definitive numbers that will apply to all hardware, as statistical outliers will always exist. I'm also going to assume that the media you choose for long-term storage will be unpowered most of the time and not in regular use. This is important as it means that any measure for the operational lifespan of drives is largely irrelevant, and that instead we are concerned with expected minimum data retention periods for what are termed cold or offline media. Starting with hard drives, these offer the best cost per gigabyte and should be expected to retain data for 5 years. I've personally known hard drives to retain data for well over 10 years, but data stored on hard drive platters is subject to magnetic data fade or bit rot, and I would therefore recommend refreshing hard drive data by rewriting it every 3 years. Hard drives used for long-term storage can either be external models like this one or internal drives that are connected as required using a direct SATA connection or a USB adapter. And if you opt for external drives, they are best stored in anti-static bags or dedicated cases. Next, we come to SSDs. These are generally not recommended for long-term storage due to their high cost per gigabyte as well as their relatively rapid bit rot when left unpowered. Indeed, JEDEC standard JASD218 only requires client SSDs to retain data for 365 days when powered off and stored at 30 degrees. This noted how long an unpowered SSD can retain data is a complex issue. SSDs store data by moving electrons into position in flash memory cells, and over time electron leakage or unwanted retention can occur. The extent of this depends on how many program erase or PE cycles an SSD has endured, whilst the seriousness of it relates to how many different states are stored in each flash memory cell. For example, triple-level cell or TLC drives store 3 bits per cell, whilst quad-level cell or QLC drives store 4. And the latter requires more accurate electron patterns to be maintained. Putting all of this together, a new TLC SSD that has endured very few PE cycles will almost certainly be able to retain data for 3 years in an unpowered state. But a new QLC drive should not be trusted for more than a year. These figures assume that an SSD is stored at no more than 30 degrees C, as high temperatures accelerate electron leakage. If you choose to use an SSD for long-term storage, read all of its data once a year for a TLC drive and more regularly for a QLC drive. This will trigger the SSD's controller to run a maintenance process called read scrub on all of its flash memory blocks and to rewrite any data in danger of being lost. It's also a good idea to leave the SSD connected for an hour after reading its data, as this will allow background data rewrites to complete. Next, we come to USB drives and memory cards. These also store data using TLC or QLC flash memory cells, but have less sophisticated controllers. USB drives and memory cards are generally not recommended for long-term storage, but are small and robust and will work just fine if appropriately refreshed. This said, try to use new professional or high-endurance cards as they are more likely to be TLC rather than QLC. Also make sure that you read all data at least once a year. On professional and high-endurance memory cards, this should trigger a data refresh if required. However, on lower quality media, the controller may not perform a read scrub when data is read. And so, if using general flash media, rewrite all data once a year. This will use a PE cycle, but is the only way to ensure that data will be refreshed. Moving on, how long writable optical disks can retain data is a complex question, with data loss after a few years quite common. But if you use archive quality writable media like we have here, data retention is significantly better than other media, and the only required user action over time is replacement. Current estimates are that archival-grade CDR and DVD-R disks that use a gold metal layer to prevent oxidization and corrosion should retain data for at least 50 years. And modern HTL or high-to-low BDR disks that use inorganic rather than organic dyes are also expected to retain data for at least 50 years. MDisk, DVD-R and BDR disks, which also use inorganic dyes, may potentially retain data for hundreds of years, but can only be written in MDisk-compatible drives. As these figures indicate, archival-grade optical disks are a robust choice for long-term data storage, but the cost per gigabyte is higher than for hard drives. Finally, we get to cloud storage, which still saves data on hard drives, SSDs, or sometimes LTO cartridges. But here, the retention properties of the individual media are far less important, as reputable cloud providers like Amazon, Microsoft, and Google maintain backups and migrate data to new media as servers are upgraded. Amazon, for example, claims 11 nines of data durability for its AWS S3 Glacier long-term cloud storage. And indeed, a key benefit of using the cloud is that data preservation processes become somebody else's job. However, there are no absolute guarantees, and not everybody is comfortable uploading their most valued files to a third party. This said, you can minimize the risk by using a utility like Veracrypt to write your data to encrypted containers before upload. Storing a few gigabytes of long-term data in the cloud can have no monetary cost, as Google provide 15 gigabytes of storage and Microsoft and Apple 5 gigabytes with their standard free accounts. And even a 1 gigabyte encrypted container can typically keep safe many hundreds of photographs and documents. However, if you need to preserve tens or hundreds of gigabytes, let alone terabytes of long-term files, cloud storage can get expensive, and it's important to shop around. In particular, note that even when storage costs are low, retrieving data can be expensive, with the cost sometimes depending on access speed. So, make sure you fully understand the total pricing structure before committing to a cloud service. To ensure that your long-term data is retained, in addition to choosing and refreshing media, other actions are required. For example, if you store data on optical disks, this should include keeping one or more spare optical drives. A resilient IT storage system should also include multiple copies of all data. As I've detailed in other videos, when making backups, the gold standard is the 3-2-1 rule. This means keeping 3 copies of all data on at least 2 different kinds of storage, with 1 copy held off-site. Fortunately, unlike in organizations, long-term storage for home users often involves keeping additional copies of data that remains on active systems. For example, whilst a company may move old customer records to an archive and delete the original files, most people are unlikely to put their most prized photographs into long-term storage and then remove them from all of their devices and general backups. This means that we do not necessarily have to duplicate all data held in long-term storage 3 times over. However, keeping 2 copies with 1 off-site is very wise. One way to keep an off-site copy is to put it in the cloud. But another is to store it on local media kept with a family member or friend. Indeed, a straightforward way to preserve photographs and videos is to do a family storage audit. and to make sure that several people retain copies of really important content. If you've never done this, it can be an enjoyable experience to review old photographs and videos with family members. And if it results in many relatives keeping copies of important content, you will have taken a great step to preserve your files regardless of what media are chosen. And if you can keep track of what is where and periodically refresh media as discussed earlier, then so much the better. Hopefully, this video has got you thinking about long-term storage, and anything you do as a result has got to be positive. But if you want a specific action plan, I would highlight 3 key points. Firstly, take some time to decide what really needs to be included in your long-term storage. Many of us have got backup drives that contain content that we'll probably never access again and which would not really be missed. Many people also back up files such as downloaded movies or music or software that does exist somewhere else, and whilst it will be a pain to get it back again, it's probably not high priority to include in your most important long-term storage. This said, what probably is a high priority are files that only you have got a copy of, and which have great sentimental or other value and which you could never get back. So work out what you and those close to you really would not want to lose, and then act to keep it safe. As we've discussed, to do this you need to choose one or more types of storage media and to commit to their necessary data refresh requirements. In this table I've provided a summary, and I imagine for the vast majority of people it will come down to one or a combination of hard drives, cloud storage or optical disks. But SSDs are convenient and robust, and don't dismiss the odd USB drive left with Aunt Matilda, providing that it's refreshed on an appropriate basis. And as this signals, the final step in the action plan is to make sure that you have an off-site copy. But now that's it for another video. If you've enjoyed what you've seen here, please press that like button. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. And I hope to talk to you again very soon.